Thank you. And big thanks to the organizers. I mean, are we all happy that we're actually seeing each other in person after 2 years? Woo! Pretty happy about the Aggie ice cream too. So thanks a lot. I'm assuming it's Utah State folks. So thank you. All right. I'll try to keep this lively because I know it's 4 p.m. So what we wanted to do, and I'm actually really happy that everyone minus 2 of the co-authors are here. So it's actually really nice to see people again. So this is a picture that I actually took of the inversion this past year. So we did have some in January. So I'll be talking about indoor and outdoor fine particulate matter. So again, we had the inversions, we had the wildfires. Those are the filters from my home. I always like to do this little exercise. So how long do you think that took to get from clean to dirty? So 1 month. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. All right. And then some of you are probably asleep because no one raised their hands after that. It's really 3 months. And I actually have the fortune of being able to live in a place that's really fairly clean according to our models. So we have to really think about the communities that may not be breathing this clean air and who furthermore may not have the ability to have filters. So this is kind of where this whole part starts to just all get together when we look at the impact of equitable, inclusive environments. This really the main focus of my research, and this leads to the study that I'll be presenting in a minute. So we first do some work in terms of environmental exposure, whether it's modeling or whether it's direct measurements, to then tie that in with the health outcomes. Unfortunately, economics moves the needle. And so we do quantification, economic cost of either actions or inactions, and the benefits. So we do a cost-benefit analysis to then develop enactable public policy. It's unreasonable to suspect that we can just say, hey, let's shut off all the emissions, we clean up the air. But we can say, look, we can potentially reduce 10% of emissions by doing X, Y, Z. And that's where we work with the state legislature and with other stakeholders. And then that leads to some urban planning decisions, which then feed back into the model. So that's where the circle ended, our 5-sided circle here, until really COVID hit. And then we started to really think about the fact that we need to look at all of this through a lens of equity to make sure that all communities benefit equally from these actions. Really, when we take a look at Salt Lake County, we look at the social demographic distribution, we see how the West Side is much more affected. It's much more challenged community. It has a higher percentage of blue collar workers, what we really euphemistically considered, or we called them, essential workers. Unfortunately, as we know, through the COVID pandemic, they became expendable workers. And we also see that it's a much lower income group and a higher percent of ethnic diversity. So why is this all important? Well, one way to get out of poverty, one way to really move up the social ladder is through education. But if we have issues, and those are some of our recent studies that show that PM 2.5 and ozone lead to increased absences, it also leads to lower test scores. So we looked at standardized test scores on 3rd grade students. So again, these studies focus on the outside air pollution, but the reality is we spend about 90% of our time indoors. So let's take a look at that. I'll do one last outdoor plot here, and this is something that I always show, and people just kind of, it really resonates, because the way that I've done that I've color coded this is the more red, the more west in Salt Lake City, and the more blue, the more east. And we can see, especially during the winter time, so in December 2017, the left plot, we can see how much higher the PM 2.5 is at those schools. So all of those lines represent a school. And as I mentioned, more red, more west, more blue, more east. This is really an event that we saw, a dust storm, that really triggered the study really of schools and their air quality. So this is a dust storm. This happened in, I think it was 2018. And we can really see how this is from our building, our atmospheric sciences building, looking into downtown Salt Lake. I don't need to tell you about, dust storms. We all are pretty good at knowing about that, but we can see how it really came in. And the logo's up there kind of covering the time, but you can see it was 10:48, which is about recess time for many schools. And so even though we do have some recess guidance, I also work with the Department of Health to look at recess guidance. So when we tell kids that they can't go out, et cetera, that's part of the work that our team does, but it's not necessarily followed as much. So What are the economic impacts of air pollution on school children? Well, there are three impacted groups. Schools budget $40 per day per student. So if a student is absent, then that money is not spent on that student's education. The average wage in Salt Lake City was $23. Right now, it's about $24, $25, but that was the time of the study. So a parent, for example, who has to stay home because the child is absent is going to be losing about $200 in income. And then 56% of students depend on free and reduced meals, about $5 a day. So that's that loss that the family has to carry. And then we have the economic multiplier. Economic multiplier just basically means that what is the amount that your wages really mean to the full economy. So really quick example, if I were to contract someone to do about $10,000 worth of work in my house, that person will probably only be earning about $4,000 in wage. The rest will be spent in materials, taxes, transportation. So that is the overall effect on the economy. And we see that the school absences related to poor quality are about $450,000 a year. So this is what drives needle in terms of political change. And this has led to some policy that I'm happy to discuss later. So this is our study. Our study area, you can see the two schools are, they're a little bit hard to see. There are these symbols right here. So this is West High and this East High. So what we looked at was the outside and the inside particulate matter levels. And we can see there's a full study period. And I'm focusing right now on one of the events. We had a dust storm and we also had an inversion event. We can see that there are substantial differences in terms of the outdoor air pollution, but I'll just kind of give it away. The inside air pollution was actually quite similar, which was very comforting to know that at least the kids were feeling pretty safe and were not exposed to worse air pollution simply because of the side of the city they lived in. So one of the things that we always like to do is to compare our readings to make sure that we're within the ballpark of regulatory sensors. So East High is somewhat close to Hawthorne, and West High is close to Rose Park. Now, again, where those DAQ sites are, there's a little bit more traffic. And so we did expect to have lower outside air pollution at the two schools. And then we also wanted to compare the inside versus the outside. And this is where we now start to see some of the differences. So East High had the inside air pollution was about 60% compared to about 57% for West High, which again, because we do know that West High has higher levels of pollution outside, then this makes sense. The filters are working more, they're protecting the children more. So this is our pollutant accumulation. And we're doing, we analyze this at both the hourly level and the minute by minute level. And we can really see these values here. And we can see the black and the green lines are the outside, and then the red and the blue are the inside levels. So this is just for a visual, but here's something that we found that we were actually really excited to see. Was we started to look at the lag. So how long does it take for poor quality outside to enter the schools? And what we did was we lagged by 1 minute, all the way from 1 minute to 180 minutes to 3 hours to really find the highest R value, the highest correlation, because what we want to see is we want to match up those patterns. And the patterns that we saw were both inversion and also the peak traffic hours. So we see our highest level there at 57-minute lag, and you can now start to see a very strong pattern there. So there's a very strong association. We're very happy that we found that, and that was really it wasn't something that we really looked at the beginning, but it turns out that that's probably the most exciting part of our findings. The second event was a dust storm. Now, unfortunately, the sensors at West High were not working, but we still have the data from East High. And you can see the dust storm, it actually was really in two phases, one right around noon and one right around 3 p.m. We saw those peaks, and you can actually see them reflected, obviously much less on the inside sensor. So here we saw again that there was a peak, but then we also saw when we actually plotted after the lag, when we saw that two distinct patterns. So one is much steeper in a sense, but then when we start to look at the right side of the plot, we see it's almost a linear pattern. Now, we did not specifically look any further. We didn't want to subdivide this, but we do think that some of that, obviously those higher values are associated with the dust storm. And we think that because of the composition, it's slightly different. Now, the inversion event, of course, as we all know, that is primarily composed of secondary PM 2.5. And in previous work, we have found that the PM 2.5 most likely dissociates as soon as it enters the building. Why? Because inside the building, it is warmer and it is less humid. So we do think that there's that effect. And whereas here, for example, the dust event is actually dust. It's not changing into anything. So that's something that we really want to be looking at in more detail. That's all I have for you right now. I'm happy to take any questions.
No questions? Throw this too far.
I just had a question because I'm on the clean air committee at my kids' elementary school, and it looks like the district policy in Salt Lake is really just based on like when they can go outside. But when I spoke with the principal, as far as the air filtration and things like that, that seemed like it's decided more on the school level. And so like our particular school, they required MERV 13 filtration, and HEPA is actually in the classrooms during COVID. But I was curious, at what point is the district or the county advising on what levels of filtration the schools are using and things like that?
So this was a study done in 2018, and back then it was MERV 8. And now my understanding is that it's gone up to 13 or 14, which is the most that you can, that your standard HVAC that's sitting at the schools currently can handle. The reason why they can't go any further than that is because there'd be too much pressure drop, and that would potentially just ruin the furnace. Yes. If we were to repeat this, I think it would be.
So the Mountain View Corridor Working Group has done a project with 5 schools over many years, doing indoor and outdoor monitoring and replacing HVAC systems and so on and so forth. So there's probably data out there that you can look at to provide some additional inputs for indoor and outdoor and different HVAC ratings.
That'll be very helpful. I'll definitely contact you. Thanks.
Any other questions? Hate to say it, but I always have a question or two. Was there any difference between the HVAC systems at East High and West High?
We didn't find any. When we spoke with the facilities manager, they said they were very similar.
Okay. And then also, just as a comment, we've done similar kind of thing in Cache Valley, and we did look at the ionic contributions on the filters, and exactly right, on the indoor, the ammonium nitrate went away. It was almost just not even present on the filters at that point. Right. Yeah.
For the time lag that you observed between outdoor and indoor, did you ever have any instances where there was just a really quick blip of outdoor increase, like a wildfire, and then that didn't translate into indoor, or does it always translate into indoor?
It gets muted. So very short spikes here. For example, you can appreciate there are 3 spikes on the noon peak there, and it really only reflects sort of cumulatively in the end. So again, it was just, we just coded, and then we hope for the best when we ran the lag.
I've got one last question then. What type of instrumentation did you use to measure the PM?
Oh, the ES642s, the med ones.
Other questions? Well, thank you.